Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Pond's mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 53. Today we explore The Coming of the Huns, one of Conan Doyle's tales of long ago, written and published in 1910. And here's Paul to introduce the story.
Weary of the infighting between Christian sects in Fourth Century Constantinople, the Trinitarian Simon Melas heads northwards beyond the Dneister to live a secluded life of contemplation. Yet even in the wilderness he cannot find complete solitude. In a neighbouring cave he encounters an established hermit, Paul of Nicopolis. Their discourse, however, proves short-lived, as Paul is a follower of the rival Arian philosophy. One evening, 2 years into his retreat, Simon's peace is disturbed by the fleeting appearance of an oddly conformed stranger. The next morning, the plain beneath his refuge is covered by a vast multitude of horsemen heading steadily westwards.
The Coming of the Huns was one of a series of historical vignettes written around 1910 that Conan Doyle later collected as Tales of Long Ago. Today it's a mostly forgotten collection, unfortunately, but Conan Doyle regarded it extremely highly. In 1922 he wrote, "If all my works were to be destroyed save only that one single section which I might elect to preserve, my choice would certainly be those short historical pictures which came under the heading of Tales of Long Ago." Now, the reason he regarded them so highly is not simply because they are historical pieces like The White Company or Sir Nigel, but because they were parables intended to educate, inform, and entertain modern and inquiring audiences. And that this was deliberate is really clear from surviving correspondence. On 14th of May 1910, he wrote to the Strand editor Greenhouse Smith to alert him to two stories he'd recently had published in rival journals. "I wonder if you saw the two sketches, The Last Galley and The Passing of the Legions, the one dealing with the British naval question in parable, the other with the abandonment of India question in the same way." What prompted him to write these vignettes at this time is something that we'll go into, but we do know a little bit about the writing process, and here we should reintroduce Conan Doyle's school friend, James or Jimmy Ryan. And in Memories and Ventures, when thinking about his time at Stonyhurst, the Jesuit school he attended before university, Conan Doyle wrote, "Save for one school fellow, James Ryan, a remarkable boy who grew into a remarkable man, I carried away no lasting friendship from Stonyhurst." Ryan was in the year below Conan Doyle, but they became very good friends, perhaps because they were both Scots of Irish descent. Ryan would actually follow Conan Doyle to Edinburgh to study medicine, and he became Brian Charles Waller's lab assistant briefly. But ultimately he abandoned a medical career when he inherited the family's tea plantations in Sri Lanka, what was then called British Ceylon. He worked out in Sri Lanka for most of his life and died in 1920. And Ryan is probably the Tom who we mentioned in the Haunted Grange of Goresthorpe episode. He's a school friend of the main character who set sail for coffee estates of his father in Ceylon. And he's possibly then also the influence for Victor Trevor. But when he wasn't running the plantation, Ryan was an avid student of ancient history, and especially the history of Rome. We're fortunate in that a lot of the correspondence between Jimmy Ryan and Conan Doyle survives for the year 1910, in fact, for the 1910s generally. And it really does show that Ryan acted as a kind of almost unpaid research assistant for Conan Doyle, diving into original documents and histories and sending lengthy notes and often pages of notes to Conan Doyle in response to some of his sort of historical queries about the stories he was writing. And we do find in those letters that Ryan gave Conan Doyle the idea for the short story The Iconoclast, which also made it into Tales of Long Ago.
Yes, I mean, Andrew Lycett comments in his biography at one point about Ryan's involvement with this project and talks about Conan Doyle rejecting Ryan's idea for a story set in the arena featuring pygmies and okapi.
Yeah, Ryan did also make a suggestion to change bits of the Lost World and probably gave him the title of the Poisoned Belt as well. So maybe he had better luck in some of his suggestions than others.
The other role that Ryan could possibly have played in Conan Doyle's fiction is that he could well have been the fictional recipient of the fictional Stark Munro letters.
There isn't anything, though, in the correspondence about the coming of the Huns specifically, but we do know they were discussing Roman history as early as January 1910, and they kept up that correspondence throughout the year. In fact, Ryan had to return to a second home he had in Rome to consult some books and manuscripts and send Conan Doyle some more information. One of the notable things about Coming of the Huns, though, is that it wasn't published in the Strand, but appeared in a rival journal, Scribner's magazine, in November 1910. Whether it was offered to the Strand is unclear. Quite possibly it had been offered and rejected, because a letter from Conan Doyle to Greenough Smith in November 1910 indicates that the Strand might have been cool on the project as a whole, as they'd only recently rejected another of the Tales of Long Ago called Giant Maximin. He said, "I think you were wise to refuse Giant Maximin as an isolated sketch. I think, however, if I may say so, that it was not good policy to let little series by me appear in Scribner's and the London simultaneously, when it would all have made one long Strand series." In the end, though, The Coming of the Huns was included in the Lascali Impressions and Tales in 1911, with illustrations by N.C. Wyeth, who had originally illustrated the Scribner's story, and it was later collected in 1922 in Tales of Long Ago, as it was called in the UK, and The Last of the Legions and Other Tales of Long Ago, as it was known in the US. So a collection that Conan Doyle was particularly fond of, and probably that does owe quite a lot to the fact that it is historical fiction, which is something that he both looked up to and admired and enjoyed writing himself.
Yeah, and it's quite fascinating the way he goes off in a different direction with these stories, and doubly interesting in the quote you gave earlier about of all my work, this is what I would save. So it's basically saying above even the White Company.
Yeah, that's right.
So as you say, he was proud of his historical fiction, like the White Company, Sir Nigel, Micah Clarke, the Refugees. But these are all quite long, sprawling, epic historical writing. You're following the tradition of Walter Scott. And then to take a different period, the ancient world going into the Dark Ages, and to take the format of the short story,
yes,
rather than the novel, it's a really interesting move.
Yeah.
And not only that, he also takes the format not just to tell a story, but, as you've pointed out, to make them parables or allegories.
Yeah.
And whether the subtext is as important as the story or the ostensible story here. So he's doing something different. I think that's possibly why he was so proud of these.
Yes.
Because they're written in a very specific way to do a very specific job, but they're written in a very entertaining style as well. So there's no hitting you over the head with the message. It's there, and you'll see it if you can. It's kind of interesting to speculate why he chose this particular sort of period. I mean, it sounds like from what you were saying that James Ryan may have played a part in this. Maybe his enthusiasms for ancient Rome communicated themselves to Doyle, and Doyle thought, this would be interesting, and he got caught up in it. There was a certain amount of this sort of writing at the time. I mean, one of the big names was the American writer Francis Marion Crawford.
Yes.
Who also wrote kind of very good weird fiction, but also moved and was fascinated by Roman history himself, and again lived in Italy. So soaked up the atmosphere. So he was busy writing these sort of stories. And before him, there'd been big epics. I mean, Wilkie Collins, surprisingly, his first published novel, Antonina, or The Fall of Rome, in 1850, was a great sprawling Roman epic. Or before him, in 1834, we got Bulwer Lytton, who we've talked about quite a few times on the podcast, with The Last Days of Pompeii.
Yes.
Which is a huge hit at the time. So this stuff is very much in the air. And other kind of separate novels. You got Lew Wallace, the American general, publishes Ben-Hur in 1880, or you got the Polish nationalist writer Henryk Sienkiewicz writing Quo Vadis, published in 1895. So there's a market for this kind of thing. But what Doyle does that's different is he doesn't write this in epic form.
Yes,
he writes, as you say, as little vignettes.
Yeah.
And it really works nicely. And nobody else was doing this at the time. And the only one who comes near, and it's an odd story, is John Buchan, who published a wonderful short story called The Lemnian, which is about a resident of Lemnos who is going to pay homage at the Delphic shrine and gets caught up in the Battle of Thermopylae.
Yes.
And fighting with the Spartans in their kind of last stand. And again, he's using a short story, and at the very human level, set against this great historical backdrop, which is what Doyle is doing here. But the timing is very interesting with the Lemnian, because it's first published in Blackwood's magazine in January 1911.
Yes.
As you say, The Coming of the Huns is first published in November 1910. So Doyle is writing these stories at the same time. And a later publication of the Lemnian is in a book, a multi-authored anthology called Rosemary, which was published to raise money for the war wounded of the First World War. So you've got Buchan's The Lemnian in that, and also in that is The Lord of Falconbridge by Conan Doyle, one of his Regency boxing stories, which also appeared in the Last Galley.
Yeah. Very good. I mean, I think the other possible influence here is maybe not necessarily other historical novelists, but maybe historians. So, I think when we think about sort of shorter pieces and parables, the person that comes to mind there is Macaulay. And we know Conan Doyle was a big fan of Macaulay. He spoke about reading Macaulay's essays and taking them with him throughout his student days, through his trip down to West Africa and his whaling voyages as well. And when he went to London for the first time in the 1870s as a young man, he went to Westminster Abbey to sort of pay homage at the grave of Macaulay. But a particular note there is Macaulay's great narrative poems, The Lays of Ancient Rome. And that feels to me like it's a really important influence, because again, Macaulay wasn't writing it as a dispassionate historian. There are no dispassionate historians. He wrote it as he was, a Whig politician who'd argued for the Great Reform Act and was advocating for the extension of the franchise. And so when he's writing things like the first of the Lays of Ancient Rome, which is Horatius, he puts in a nod to Horatius creating a kind of almost classless society, which is a very political point he's making there. And, Conan Doyle knew Horatius very well. He actually said of it that he had the good fortune to learn it off by heart when he was a child. And in a letter to somebody, he said, it stamped itself on my plastic mind so that even now I can reel off almost the whole of it, which is amazing. But so I think we got Macaulay and definitely Gibbon an influence, but we'll come back to Gibbon later as well. But it is interesting what you say about the other people who are writing historical fiction. I couldn't really find other people writing short historical vignettes. Lots of people come to mind. I know Conrad wrote The Duel, which came out in Pall Mall Gazette in 1908, which became the great Ridley Scott movie, The Duelists, in the 70s. But others writing. The only other person I could sort of see that you haven't mentioned yet is Maurice Hewlett, whose The Life and Death of Richard Yeohnay came out in 1900, which is a sprawling Crusader epic about Richard the Lionheart. But that was of particular interest to T. Lawrence.
Yeah, it's Lawrence absolutely loved that book, and there is a sort of letter that he wrote to his family in 1912, in which he says, "Read Richard Yea and Nay in Egypt for the 9th time. It is a masterpiece." And at the time of his death in 1935, the library at Clouds Hill, his Dorset cottage, had 8 different Hewlett novels in it.
Wow. I mean, the other thing in thinking about sort of thinking about this as a parable is who else is kind of writing parables around this time? And
Mm,
the other body of work that springs to mind is probably H.G. Wells.
mm,
And interestingly, he of course is looking to the future or an
yeah.
alternative present, whereas Conan Doyle has decided he's going to look to the past.
Mm,
But in both cases, they're trying to make connections to the present day as
mm,
warnings or
mm.
foreshadowings or however you'd put it.
And there is another possible model as well in Rudyard Kipling,
Oh yes,
because he's brought out 2 volumes of historical parable stories,
mm,
Puck of Pook's Hill in 1906 and Rewards and Fairies in
mm,
1910. And these are ostensibly aimed at children.
yeah, yeah,
And their purpose, the purpose of the parables is different to what Doyle is trying to do, but nevertheless, it again provides some sort of model
yeah,
and way of looking at the past and how the past informs the present, and even the ancient past
yes,
informs the present. And Kipling's getting his inspiration from moving to Sussex
yes,
and falling in love with the countryside, and almost the Indian Kipling being replaced by the very English
English, yeah,
Kipling is what's coming out there. And to come back as well to your earlier point with Macaulay,
mm,
that Doyle's first copy of Lays of Ancient Rome was a gift
yeah,
to him at Stonyhurst from his very influential great uncle Michael Conan.
yes,
And this is where he fell in love with this book. And again, interesting to speculate. He's reading this at Stonyhurst. Is he talking about it to Jimmy Ryan
yeah,
at
maybe,
that stage
yeah,
and enthusing each other?
yeah, very good point. Yeah,
Mm,
it could easily be the case. Yeah.
mm,
So let's look at the story itself, and it starts with this really quite adept piece of writing, this sort of sweeping historical scene setting, where Conan Doyle talks about the state of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, and particularly the state of the Christian religion, which he describes as a scandal and a disgrace. And this is because he's setting up this tension, as you've described in the introduction, Paul, between the characters of Simon Melas and Paul of Nicopolis. But it's actually quite a specific tension that he's discussing, which is the Arian controversy, which was essentially a doctrinal difference that came out at the beginning of the 4th century. And the main strife was really between sort of two rival doctrines, one of which essentially believed in the Trinity and the other didn't. And in the case of the story here, Conan Doyle starts with a description of one kind of sect that was threatening the kind of orthodoxy, which was the Donatists in North Africa. He then goes on to these 2 sort of rival sects that are debating the Trinity, the Homoousian and the Homoousian, if I've got the pronunciation correct. But he's almost making a point in choosing those 2 sects because the difference between them, as you look at the names on paper, is literally one vowel. And this is kind of the point that he's making, I think, which is that actually you've got this doctrinal difference between 2 sects, which I think probably to his view was a bit kind of nitpicky, but actually at the time it was
mm,
an enormously significant controversy, and it came right to the attention of the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, who was so concerned about this that he formed the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD or CE, and the main question to be determined there was who or what is Christ, and can he be both God and man? And the reason why Constantine, who had allowed Christian freedoms within the Roman Empire, the reason why he's so interested in this controversy is that he just wants this to go away. He actually wants Christianity to get on with it within itself, and also with other sects too. And the idea was to try to settle it. What came out of it, the Nicene Creed, was effectively establish that belief in the Trinity, which has been the heart of early Christianity and since. It's probably worth saying, though, at this point, that when we talk about Arian, it's not to be confused with the racial term Arian. This is Arian, Arian, rather than with a Y. But for context's sake, the alternative Arian, the Arian with a Y, was actually in the air at this point. It was something that had really come out with the book by H.S. Chamberlain, The Foundations of the 19th Century, which was published in 1899. It's a horrifically anti-Semitic book, and it was weaponized by the Nazis in the 1930s. This is a different Arian we are talking about here in the context of this story. But I do think it is interesting he chooses this particular controversy, not just because it was contemporary with the events that we're going to describe, which is around 375 AD, but also because it's really talking about challenging the idea that the Bible is literally true, or that the Word of God is literally true, or the Logos is literally true. And so this, I think, ties into his transition to spiritualism, which I think we can come back to when we got to the end of the story.
Mm.
And the Arian controversy is the backdrop to essentially the tension, the almost comic tension that we get really between the character of Simon Melas, this Trinitarian who is actually would be classed, I think, as quite moderate. He's quite horrified by the persecutions of the other sects, but goes into the wilderness essentially to retire to become a hermit, where he meets Paul of Nicopolis, who unfortunately has entirely the opposite view. I mean, there's the comedy of the two hermits meeting in the middle of nowhere and then having 180-degree, opposite views. It's a great piece of writing, isn't it, with Paul? Out with you, out of my cell, he cried. Have I lived here so long to have it polluted by a vile Trinitarian, a follower of the rascal Athanasius? Wretched idolater. Learn once for all that the Logos is in truth an emanation from the deity and in no sense equal or co-eternal with him. Out with you, I say, or I will dash out your brains with my staff, which is also a nice bit of foreshadowing. Chekhov's staff. And then we get our third character in this, which is Caius Crassus, a Roman officer from Tyrrhus, who turns up and has a conversation with Simon, and he puts almost a third point of view. He's putting this kind of non-Christian view, and he suggests that maybe Simon could read the works of the divine Plato or Marcus Aurelius, at which point Simon becomes just as intolerant as Paul of Nicopolis does as well. So you've got actually really quite a nice setup here from something that's quite a complex piece of religious history. Suddenly, just in the space of a handful of conversations, it's treated, quite light, but actually it's getting the point across, isn't it? About this, these are kind of doctrinal differences that I would say, in Conan Doyle's view, don't really matter a great deal.
But it's an interesting foreshadowing of what his own life is going to become.
Yeah.
Certainly after the First World War, where he's going to become just as intransigent.
Yeah, absolutely.
In his own beliefs. As he's almost as bad as Paul of Nicopolis, really, in his later life.
Completely.
In that he's closing his mind off to alternatives, and it becomes quite clear in this story that Caius Crassus is an admirable character.
Yeah,
because he's just common sense.
Yes.
Attitude of just live and let live, and hey, we've got greater threats out there.
Yes.
All that sort of attitude is coming in, and the fact that Doyle himself then turns into almost one of these intolerant characters. It's like he hasn't taken the message of his own story.
Well, that's right. That's absolutely right. And I think him poking at the kind of doctrinal differences, and what he's doing is he's setting up for an attack on Orthodox religion as a spiritualist. I mean, this is him laying some foundations for what he is going to go on to say as well. So I do think it's all mixed up in here as well. But you're right, he becomes just as intolerant as Paul of Nicopolis. Very much so. So once Conan Doyle's established the three principal actors in the story, Simon, Paul, and Caius, we then get this sort of quite quiet interlude where a year passes in the life of Simon. And it's, I think what characterizes this piece more than anything else is the quality of the writing. It's really some very beautiful passages that Conan Doyle writes here. It starts with a lyrical description of the kind of landscape that Simon is observing from the caves as he's on obviously an elevated piece of land looking out eastwards, and then all he can see is the empty plains stretching out into the distance. There was nothing on earth to draw his eye or to distract his mind, for the grassy plain below was as void from month to month as the heaven above. But all of this changes one day when he sees this strange figure standing on a peak, his outline black in the fading light, which is yet again, I think, the man on the tour moment. We've had this is one of the Conan Doyle's famous images, goes right way back to the winning shot that we covered in a very early episode as well. But essentially, he sees this figure briefly, who then disappears, and the next morning he is left wondering if he'd imagined the figure. But then you get into the passage where essentially the whole world is starting to turn upside down.
As Simon stared out over the plain, in his wildest dream he had never imagined such a sight. The whole vast expanse was covered with horsemen, hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands, all riding slowly and in silence out of the unknown east. It was the multitudinous beat of their horses' hoofs which caused that low throbbing in his ears. Some were so close to him as he looked down upon them that he could see clearly their thin, wiry horses, and the strange humped figures of their swarthy riders, sitting forward on the withers, shapeless bundles, their short legs hanging stirrupless, their bodies balanced as firmly as though they were part of the beast. And then he goes, all day, held spellbound by this wonderful sight, the hermit crouched in the shadow of the rocks, and all day the sea of horsemen rolled onward over the plain beneath. Simon had seen the swarming quays of Alexandria. He had watched the mob which blocked the hippodrome of Constantinople. Yet never had he imagined such a multitude as now defiled beneath his eyes, coming from that eastern skyline which had been the end of his world. Sometimes the dense streams of horsemen were broken by droves of brood mares and foals, driven along by mounted guards. Sometimes there were herds of cattle. Sometimes there were lines of wagons with skin canopies above them. But then, once more, after every break, came the horsemen, the hundreds and thousands and the tens of thousands, slowly, ceaselessly, silently drifting from the east to the west. The long day passed, the light waned, and the shadows fell. But still the great broad stream was flowing by.
It's wonderful, isn't it? It's a really brilliant description.
It's absolutely fantastic, and you can envisage this.
Yeah.
So well written. It's you can see it on the screen.
Yes, that's one of the hallmarks of Conan Doyle's writing, particularly his short fiction, is that it's so visual. And this does lend itself to a rather wonderful accompanying image, which is that Wyeth illustration we talked about right at the beginning.
Yeah, so we've got Simon looking out over the rocks, and you can see in the distance the horsemen. And there was then another version of that same picture done by Claude Percival Shilton, which was used for the dust jacket of the UK edition of Tales of Long Ago. And it's this same image of Simon, but in the Shilton version, Simon looks like some sort of Homeric poet.
Yes,
looking into these horsemen, but both are wonderful images.
Yes, fantastic. And of course, what we're seeing here is the arrival of the Huns into,
and it's the way he does this as well with their arrival is it's a really clever use of language.
Yeah.
In that he emphasizes the numbers. You can almost get the beat in your head, but it's by that repetition of phrases, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. He repeats phrases over and over and gives that a beat of its own. It's brilliant.
Yeah, I particularly like the fact that the first thing Simon notices is wrong is this kind of drone. And it's only when he gets out of the cave and looks down that he realizes it's all the horse's hooves.
Mm.
and the sheer noise is just becoming this background noise that sort of builds and builds and builds. It's a
Mm.
really brilliant piece of writing, and if Conan Doyle was to keep only one story from Tales of Long Ago, it would probably be this one,
Mm.
because it is fantastic in terms of both the ability to convey these enormous, apocalyptic events, but
Mm.
also mix it in with comedy and a bit of narrative history as well. It's really very accomplished.
Mm.
Now, we should say something about the Huns and where they came from. We actually know very little about the Huns. We know they were nomadic people who lived in Central Asia, Caucasus, and latterly sort of Eastern Europe in the 4th to 6th century. Their origins are very unclear, and it has been debated quite recently about whether or not they originated in Mongolia. But by the time of their arrival in Eastern Europe, it was fairly clear to commentators that the Huns were made up of a collection of peoples from the steppes.
Mm.
And the Huns did arrive on the scene as dramatically as is depicted in the story. The Roman Empire first became aware of the arrival of the Huns in the Eastern Empire when the Goths and the Alans were displaced by their arrival, and these were tribes and peoples that the Romans had fought for years and years and years, and suddenly they found the Goths and the Alans coming towards them for protection from this great unknown coming from out of the east. And a lot of the historians talk about the Great Migration, this idea that the collapse of the Western Roman Empire really came about because there was an influx of peoples that had come from the east. And although recently, people have been talking about climate change being one of the possible reasons for migration, which is very topical today, of course. Certainly it was very hard to live on the steppes, because in winter it could get to -40, and in summer it could be 40 degrees above. So, it's difficult place as well. But the thing that we should remember about the Huns is that we don't have any records from the Huns themselves. They weren't a literate people. They left no written records. So our view of the Huns is largely based on the recorded texts of people who experienced the massive influx of people and were suitably terrified. I mean, one of the most important people who recorded this event was Jerome, Saint Jerome, who is famous for translating the Bible into Latin, the Vulgate Bible, in the 380s. So after this period of time, but before he got to translate the Bible, he wrote a thing called the Chronicle, which was essentially a kind of universal history. It's quite fascinating because it goes back and includes things like Greek mythology within it as well. But essentially, it stopped when he was writing it, which was around 376 AD, CE, around exactly the same time this story is set. But he sort of ends it in a kind of, and there's nothing else to write now because everything's up in the air. And certainly when scholars came back and looked at things like the Chronicle later, they put 376 as a kind of key dividing line in the sand in the history of Europe. So it is, tempting to think that Conan Doyle is kind of over dramatizing this historical moment, but it does genuinely appear to have been just as sort of sudden and as hard hitting as is dramatically depicted here with the arrival of the horses coming over the plains.
And it's as you say, with the dating, it's a bit more difficult with the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire. We've got one of history's more certain punctuation marks with the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453. But here things are, as you say, it's a bit more flowing.
Yes.
And the fact that Conan Doyle has chosen to set the coming of the Huns where he has set it in this area of Europe around kind of the periphery and the Romanian fringe.
Yes.
It's somewhere that had attracted another author, one of Conan Doyle's friends, Bram Stoker, had also been interested in this area, and obviously uses Transylvania, which is part of Roman Dacia, part of modern Romania, to Count Dracula's castle. And you've also got the kind of the race stuff that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
also comes very much into Dracula, and the Count himself calls the area of Transylvania where he lives, or this part of Eastern Europe. He refers to it as the whirlpool of European races. But it's not just European races, as he himself says in Dracula, in one of his interminable lectures to Jonathan Harker. So, here too they found the Huns, whose warlike fury had swept the earth like a living flame, till the dying peoples held that in their veins ran the blood of those old witches, who, expelled from Scythia, had mated with the devils in the desert. Fools, fools! What devil or what witch was ever so great as Attila, whose blood is in these veins? He held up his arms. So Dracula is boasting of kinship to Attila and the Huns. And again, like this story, it is a kind of Dracula is an invasion story from the east. As the Count, this latter-day Hun, as it were, moves to colonize Britain with vampires.
Yes. I mean, Attila is about 75 years after the setting of this story, but Attila's kind of the peak of the Huns, isn't he?
And he's the poster boy.
He is the poster boy. That's right. One of the strange rabbit warrens I went down when doing the background research on this was that somebody had sort of. It was actually a review on TripAdvisor of all things. Somebody had suggested on TripAdvisor that a location in what's sort of present-day Moldova could actually be the setting for the coming of the Huns, which is a location called Old Arai, present-day Moldova, but actually not that far from this area that you're talking about, Dacia and Transylvania. It's actually, looking at photographs of it, I'll put one in the show notes. So it is quite appealing in that it's a kind of arc of caves that all look eastward towards a really flat plain. And you can imagine it being, it certainly was one of the places where the Huns broke into Eastern Europe. But you can imagine that whole invasion narrative is so immensely strong. And, I was saying before about the fact that we shouldn't confuse the Arian and the Arian with a Y in this description of the story. But it is definitely part of the context that there is an increasing concern about race and particularly this idea of pollution of the race, which starts to appear in lots of other narratives around this time. You start to get in Kipling as well and things like that. So, maybe it is all part of this same kind of melting pot.
Oh, quite definitely. And brought into pop culture, as in Dracula, it's putting these messages in, and the appeal of all this and this sort of period to writers like Stoker and like Doyle is the vagueness.
Yes.
That you've got this ground for. You've either got it for writers of fiction can let their imaginations run free, or you've got people with crackpot political or racial theories can let their imaginations run free in this stuff as well.
And of course, once the Huns have arrived, the story is going to end very, very quickly. We have Simon deciding to visit Paul of Nicopolis and discovering that his head has been beaten in with a crucifix, which is Conan's not going light on the messaging here. But it does lead to the wonderful moment where Simon is essentially cowering in Paul's cave when the Hun warrior returns. And he picks up Paul's cudgel and bludgeons the man to death. And it has this brilliant line from Conan Doyle, which is, one roof covered the first slain of Europe and of Asia, which is, such a brilliant line. That to me would be my pipe and slippers moment. I'd be going, I'm not going to write anything better than that in my lifetime, so I'm going to retire at this point. But you then get this slightly strange coda where Simon decides he takes the Hun's horse and he rides to Tyras to alert Caius. We do have that, the final moment. To arms, he croaked, to arms, the day of wrath has come. And as he looked, the Romans saw far across the river a great dark shadow which moved slowly over the distant plain. One thing that you were saying before we came on, Paul, was that it's peculiar that we discover quite late on in the story that Simon is a warrior.
Yeah, it's to me it's one of the few weaknesses of what is a very strong story. is we don't get enough of Simon's background. We think he's just a philosopher type,
Yes.
a scholar. And then it turns out that there cometh the hour, cometh the man kind of
Yeah.
stuff appears at the end rather unexpectedly.
Yeah.
It's fine him, beating the Hun to death, because that's the actions of a frightened man who
Yes. Yeah.
is caught up in the moment. But then to find this out, that it kind of spoils it for me in a way, because as he watches the horde come in the first place, his military instincts would have kicked
Yeah,
straight
you
in
would have thought
anyway,
so. Mm.
rather than just watching it all.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
And there's another one thing I do like about the scene in the cave as well, where you've talked about the symbolism of Paul of Nicopolis being killed by his own crucifix. But then you have the symbolism of Simon picks up the cudgel which Paul had waved at him
Yes. Yeah.
in threat and uses that
Yes. Yeah.
to kill
That's
it.
a good point.
Yeah, again, there's layer upon layer.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good
I
point.
mean, Doyle, he's really thought about this story.
Yeah, I mean, and that's really where I think we come back to the historians and to Gibbon in particular, because I think here Conan Doyle is brilliantly summarizing kind of Gibbon's central thesis of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Gibbon essentially argued that Rome's demise was the consequence of a kind of decay from within, and the erosion of sort of civic virtues and the rise of a kind of religious intolerance, which ultimately made it vulnerable to attacks from without. Conan Doyle was hugely influenced by Gibbon. He wrote a series of articles called Before My Bookcase in 1894, which ultimately he reworked into Through the Magic Door in 1907. And he said in that, if I were to spend the remainder of my life upon an island and were condemned to choose only one book as my companion, it would certainly be Gibbon. Now, note the phrasing of that. That's exactly the same phrasing as he describes. If I was to only keep one selection of my work, it would be Tales of Long Ago. So, but that kind of echo aside, I think the really interesting thing is that he is trying to write in The Coming of the Huns a kind of Gibbon's thesis in microcosm. And the theme of a kind of weakness within the empire is something that obviously has currency and echoes for his contemporary readers, and it does tie into things like, Giant Maximin is a story which is really about militarism for its own sake. And then you have The Last of the Legions as a story about absenteeism and abandoning those countries that are dependent on you. And, they even get attacks on sort of moral character with sort of self-delusion and sycophancy in a comic story called The Contest, which is a wonderful story. So he's really quite interested in those threats from within. We saw that again with danger and the idea of Britain not being prepared for the First World War. All of this is being written at the same time. You get the sense that towards 1910, Conan Doyle is really concerned that the British Empire is weakening from within. But that doesn't preclude any kind of external threats as well. That's why you get this lovely two sides to this story in The Coming of the Huns. You get the doctrinal differences weakening it from within, and then you've got the arrival of the Huns from outside.
Yeah, and it's obviously on his mind a lot, because 3 years before this story is published, he'd written his extended essay, as it were, in book form on his own library, Through the Magic Door. And when he's talking about Edward Gibbon in that, he talks about Gibbon's theories, and he puts it thus about the Roman Empire. When the empire went rotten, it began at the top, and it took centuries to corrupt the man behind the spear. Neither did a religion of peace affect him much, for in spite of the adoption of Christianity, Roman history was still written in blood. The new creed had only added a fresh cause of quarrel and violence to the many which already existed, and the wars of angry nations were mild compared to those of excited sectaries. Then came the mighty rushing wind from without, blowing from the waste places of the world, destroying, confounding, whirling madly through the old order, leaving broken chaos behind it, but finally cleansing and purifying that which was stale and corrupt, A storm centre somewhere in the north of China did suddenly what it may very well do again. The human volcano blew its top off, and Europe was covered by the destructive debris.
Mm.
There's an awful lot of things going on there.
A lot.
The thing about the excited sector is causing more trouble than
Yep.
standard wars. He's talking about that in this story. The threat from within, the threat from without. And interestingly, the adoption of a creed of peace
Yes.
didn't help. And again, I think he could have made that perhaps more clear with the character of Simon,
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
you've got the soldier adopting the creed of peace,
Yes.
and then the soldier kicks in again. So all these ideas are going in just that short section from Through the Magic Door. You can really get a hold on what he's thinking about at this time.
Well, the thing that really leaps out from that is this comment about the threat from the east, because often, when you hear the title "The Coming of the Huns," your first thought, I would have thought, would be the Germans who were being depicted as the Huns from around this time onwards. But that's not really where he's going here. And also, we know Conan Doyle's view of the Germans was much more positive and warm around 1910, 1911. We covered in a previous episode, I think it was the one on danger, we talked about the Prince Henry tour. And while other people around him were saying, watch out, there is a threat coming from Germany, Conan Doyle was much less inclined to that view. And in fact, I did find some letters in the Jimmy Ryan correspondence where he, after the Prince Henry tour, he completely dismisses the idea that there is a kind of threat coming from Germany.
Yeah, and one of the fellow British competitors in the Prince Henry tour, General Ernest Swinton, remembered in his memoirs talking to Conan Doyle about the Panther incident.
Yes.
Where the Germans had sent the ship Panther to Agadir in Morocco and caused all kinds of international ructions. And Doyle, even then, didn't seem to be convinced by the German threat, and Swinton basically regarded him as extremely naive.
Yes, yeah.
For this, but you can feel both sides because there is an air of hysteria about the German threat at this time as well, with the kind of novels, in particular people like William Le Queux.
Yeah.
With their invasion novels. The more subtle version, of course, The Riddle of the Sands by Erskine Childers in 1903.
Yeah.
But this was all in the air.
Yeah.
And obviously the alliances at that time. We had the Entente Cordiale with France in 1904, the patching up our differences with Russia in 1907. All of that in the face of the perceived German threat, which, as we find out in 1914, as Doyle finds out, in 1914, isn't just a kind of an imaginary threat. And it is interesting, as we discussed in episode 4, that Doyle comes to this at the 11th hour.
Yes,
with danger.
Yeah,
and then joins those calling for this. But as I say, with this story, the title can be confusing and lead you perhaps down the wrong path.
Yeah.
Into wondering what he's talking about. And it is this kind of invasion from the east. Doyle does seem to have subscribed to the opinion of the time that the Huns basically came from northern China.
Yes. Yeah.
And that very telling phrase there, a storm centre somewhere in the north of China did suddenly what it may very well do again.
Yes, yes.
So I think this is what the coming of the Huns is actually about. And then the other worry that had come into the political world with the very fast rise of Japan and the westernization of Japan since the Meiji Restoration of the late 1860s, and then the Japanese defeat of Russia in 1945. Almost seeming effortless.
Yeah, that's right.
Frightened an awful lot of people and an awful lot of military thinkers in the West. And you've also got China at the time is changing.
Yes.
In 1908, Conan Doyle had written the story we discussed, I think it was episode 49, The Pot of Caviar, about the Boxer Rebellion in China. And that has a group of Europeans standing against the Boxers and then falling prey to defeatism.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is another kind of, it's another parable story. So that's going on. And China at this time, after the Boxer fiasco, there are elements within trying to modernize China, perhaps looking at Japan and thinking we can do this too. And just the year after this story is published, we get a Republic of China under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen.
Yeah.
It doesn't last. China collapses into a string of civil wars afterwards, but nevertheless,
yes,
this is worrying thinkers in the West. And I'm certainly coming to the opinion that that's more what this story is about rather than the German threat.
Yeah, I definitely think it's this over the German threat. I think the other thing is this general collapse of empire from within, and that really connects, I think, very strongly to the rise of spiritualism. And for a long time, I've thought that, for Conan Doyle to really get behind spiritualism, the British Empire needed to have fallen from his own mind, in a way, because I think he doesn't really, as much as he benefits from it, I don't think he really sees empire as a kind of economic phenomenon. He's thinking about it more as a kind of Britain as the greatest nation, and everybody should benefit from being under British rule, and the sort of civilizing mission in inverted commas that's talked about. And I think by 1910, it's very hard to defend that view. And I think he has, to some extent, the kind of capacity to bring everybody together in a kind of unifying sense that he maybe once thought the British Empire could do. I think he's starting to see that in the spiritual empire that will follow the First World War, in his depiction of spiritualism, because many of the things that he talks about, if you read his sort of early spiritualist writings, he's talking about spiritualism much in the same way as he talks about the kind of civilizing mission of empire.
And he also, in some ways, he's kind of wanting it all ways. In some way, I mean, towards the end of his life, he writes quite an astonishing book, Our African Winter.
Oh gosh!
When he talks about a visit to the tomb of Cecil Rhodes, and it's almost like he ties empire and spiritualism together
completely. Yeah.
He sees this, and the other side of his thinking is looking more westwards.
Yeah. No.
And again, he's using the analogy in various times of the Roman Empire with the British Empire, and seeing almost the handover, whereas the Roman Empire went east,
yes,
moved to Constantinople. He sees the British Empire almost, its capital London could be replaced by Chicago or Toronto.
Yes, a quartering of the
all
flag.
These ideas are going on in his mind as well, and he's obviously using his fiction to work through these ideas. And what's really interesting about the coming of the Huns and the whole Last Galley, Tales of Long Ago sort of collection is that he's doing it very deliberately.
Yes.
As parable. And he states, this is his stated aim.
Yeah.
With this.
Yeah. So we've covered a lot of ground here. I think that sort of brings us to the end of the coming of the Huns. But you can sense, I think, from this discussion today that there's, this is a story that keeps on giving. You can read it several times and really come back to new and emerging themes each time. And fascinatingly, it has echoes for us even as readers today. So I think he was probably right to pin the Tales of Long Ago and perhaps this story among them as being ones that he'd like to see preserved for posterity and attach his name to them. So that brings us to the end of this episode. If you want to find out more, you can read the show notes at doingsofdoyle.com, and please leave us a rating or review on your podcaster of choice. What have we got on the show next month, Paul?
Next month, we're back to more familiar territory, and back to the world of Baker Street, and we'll be looking at The Second Stain.
A topical one as well, for reasons we shall go into. So, until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye.
Fools, what devil or what witch was ever so great as Attila, whose blood is in these veins? He held up his arms.
Are you going to do it in that voice?
Gotta bring Dracula in.
This is the legacy of the Huns. Barbarian hordes sweeping with the full force of a tidal wave across the fertile plains of the West. A mighty tide of blood, destruction, and death. The Huns, urged on by an insatiable desire for loot, follow a leader fierce and fanatic, whose name is told in whispers like that of an evil spirit. Dangerous as a flashing blade, Attila!